This video is sponsored by the Likewise app. If you've gathered anything from this channel, I really hope it's the stupid quantity of shows I like. But sometimes the best shows are buried under Netflix, or worse, HBO Max search categories. But no more need for that now, because if you're on the hunt for a new fixation, the Likewise app uses its big brain algorithm plus input from real people to give you the best TV and movie recommendations possible. You know the Lyra to Arcane pipeline? The Likewise app optimizes that pipeline for high-speed performance. You just tell the app the genres or shows you enjoy, and Likewise will pair you with personalized stuff to watch. And if you're looking for something specific, you can ask the Likewise community. Plus, you like making lists? Rhetorical question. I'm in my room talking to myself. I love making lists. I've been playing with the app for a couple weeks and have already meticulously sorted my shows into precise tiers and categories. If you want to see those and just interact with me on the app in general, check out the link in the description and follow me. You can come see what I've watched, am watching, and intend on watching. And there's some deep cuts in there. There's so much more than what I cover on the channel. So download Likewise through the link in the description, follow me, and come chat about the wide and embarrassing range of my TV roster. So I watched Arcane. Everything you've heard about it is true. It's extremely pretty, moving, and very hard to stop watching. Arcane is a semi-ensemble show. There are many elements and actors, but at the center of this hurricane is the story of Vi and Jinx. The tragedy of these two sisters is undoubtedly the emotional core of the show, and kept me watching with that perfect double whammy of a story that's as fun to analyze as engrossing to feel. Vi and Jinx are our ambassadors into the world, and for good reason. Firstly, they're an extremely effective tragedy. We empathize with and feel for their relationship. So when that relationship becomes a case study for exploring duality, we're emotionally invested in the outcome. Questions about duality abound in Arcane, but with Vi and Jinx, those questions are deeply personal. So before anything else, we need to care. Lofty and philosophical subjects mean far less if they're not threaded through characters we're invested in, and the sisters are the perfect launching point for this. There's a reason the ends of each act are so provocative, and each center around the sisters. Vi and Powder inspire empathy as the epitome of victims in this world. Family members torn apart as children. Their prologue is just devastating. There's something inherently theatrical about Arcane's approach to tragedy in general. The show's divided into 3 distinct acts, complete with tragic heroes, sibling angst, a sense of fate, and just enough poetic irony to make Aristotle sigh. Greeks don't have a monopoly on tragedy, but they at least have a few hotels, and Arcane's tragedy makes use of some of these Greek conventions. People have written dissertations about this, but let's just start with 3. Hamartia, Anagnorisis, and Peripeteia. Hamartia is the fatal flaw we've probably all heard about in English class. Good drama comes from real people, and real people have characteristics that will cause problems. Anagnorisis, a revelation that changes everything. Oedipus discovering his parentage, Luke, I am your father. And this is often followed by the 3rd event, Peripeteia, or a sudden reversal of fortune. I think this can especially become a gut punch in the form of an almost, where you see what could have been, but watch the characters lose it. Notably, Greek tragedy also required music as one of its key elements. This included a chorus, who would comment through song on how bad these unfortunate events are. Arcane's use of music, specifically at soundtrack, not at score, is a fully integrated piece of the show, and works loosely as a chorus would. The songs, particularly those bookending each act, tend to comment very directly on the events on screen, and the ones that do it especially so are linked to scenes around Vi and Jinx. And this isn't accidental, because these weren't just existing songs made to fit the story, they were written for the show itself. But Vi and Powder's story isn't just effectively sad, it's got something to say. Unsurprisingly, they have a lot to say about duality. Duality is everywhere in Arcane, within the characters, between them, and around them. But aside from just being poetic, what does this mean in practical terms? Put simply, duality offers us 2 sides of something, whether that be a place or a person or an ideology. Narratively, this creates tons of opportunities for parallels and contrasts, which aren't only super fun to notice, but they bring up rich philosophical questions. Vi and Jinx's story is especially effective because their story is structured around that very duality that exists in the world around them. So with this in mind, let's go through Vi and Jinx's story. What happened here, and why does it work so well as Arcane's narrative heart?
So come across the river and find.
Before the show even starts, it's clear that this is their story. We see Vi and Jinx's faces on the record as yin-yangs, and their younger and older selves are the respective first and last figures seen in the opening song. Vi and Powder's story begins with tragedy from the very first shot. Already at a young age, Vi is protecting Powder's innocence at the cost of her own. A delicious bit of framing here. We don't see Vi's face until we see it through Powder's eyes, cluing us in to the fact that this scene is through Powder's perspective and the adoring pedestal she has her sister on. Sad and a little bit haunting, this whole sequence establishes their basic dynamic. Vi is the older sibling and will try to protect Powder from scary things, and Powder wants to do her part to try to comfort her. Their story begins right where Vander's crossroads do, and very pointedly, as he picks up the girls, he has to put down his gauntlets, swapping out his old life of fighting for one of care. We cut to a few years later and the episode really starts. The title of the first episode, like several others, is pulled from the soundtrack. Between the on-the-nose title and the lyrics, they're making it clear. You don't get a childhood in the lanes. Already, there's this idea that people, especially young ones, lose their personhood in a city torn apart by conflict. The heist scene gives us immediate characterization. Powder wants to help, but is prone to accidents. Her inventions don't work, and she'd rather run than engage in a fight. Vi cares deeply for Powder, encouraging her but never punishing her. When the job goes sideways, Vander reprimands Vi's apparent recklessness with her own safety and with that of her adopted siblings. He basically gives her a great power, great responsibility speech, and the foreshadowing dump of the episode.
Whatever happens, it's on you.
These words, in the context of the rest of the series, are pretty haunting. Vander cautions Vi out of love, but that's still an enormous amount to put on the shoulders of a teenager. He may not have meant it then, but this primes Vi to take on a great deal of guilt. In another foreboding conversation, now complete with ominous thunder, Vander speaks to a familiar recklessness he sees in Vi, and reminds her that the fight she's itching for has a high personal cost. And in this conversation, we already get an allusion to duality within Vi's inner potential. Vi's hot-headedness doesn't just reflect Vander back to himself, it also reminds him of Silco. Between Vi's protective instincts and her impetuousness, both men's paths might be equally open to her. Sometimes the right nudge from those around us can make the difference. Act 1 also gives us two huge pieces of characterization for Powder. First, Powder isn't a violent person by nature. She's horrified at the street brawl and runs from her pursuers. Second, and equally telling, Powder is a really good shot. Hence, we see a distinction made between being coordinated and skilled and being suited for fighting. Accurately hitting targets and actively causing harm to others are very different things. So, if the heist scene had tricked you into thinking Powder isn't competent, you're swiftly corrected. Powder's good, and she knows it. But it's by fighting, specifically, that Vi helps her, and she's upset because she can't help back. Despite knowing her good intentions, and despite the fact that she's younger and smaller, Milo treats Powder with unconcealed disdain.
Don't bullshit me. We're twice the person at half her age.
See, but that's not a good thing. She shouldn't have had to have been twice her age. That itself is inherently tragic, that their value as kids is their ability to sacrifice as though they were adults. So really, by some miracle, Powder's incompetence with violence has been a mercy. It's protected her and prevented her from actively participating in war or conflict. There's no shielding them from everything, but Vander tries to protect the kids from the worst of it. So when someone has to take the fall for their botched operation, he offers himself up, locking Vi away to do so. And in what won't be the first time, Vi is forcibly prevented from helping a loved one. But she's not prevented from watching. Not just that, but this will eventually grow into the guilt that one of the times that someone took responsibility for her led directly to their death. But there's still something she can do. Taking Vander's message to heart, Vi decides it's her responsibility to now save him, while keeping Powder out of it. Once Vi's out of sight, Powder reacts poorly to this. This is so interesting because even before she's become Jinx, Powder's experiences seem to combine with a predisposition to show a thin emotional skin and a sensitivity to being left. Powder realizes she can help and goes after her sister anyway. Both have made their decisions in consideration of the other. But it's a trap. Silco orders her family killed, and in a completely pure-hearted attempt to save them, Powder goes where no kid should ever go. Where Vi tried to keep her from. And the course is set. What's gutting here is the absolute care and sincerity of it all. The tenderness with which Vi gives her the flare. That's the worst part. Vander did get through to her. She waited, and he's right. She can't risk Powder. She'll do what she has to, but at least, maybe, her sister will be okay. And Powder, the concern for Vi plain on her face, watching her sister fight for her life, hurriedly trying to get her grenades to work. It feels almost insulting to just be summarizing a scene like this. When assessing Vi and Powder's explosive last interaction, we need to keep in mind just how much happens in such little time. In the span of maybe a couple minutes, teenage Vi holds off a barrage of adults intent on killing her, watches her brothers get crushed by debris, sees Vander sacrifice himself for her again, only to be met by her sister, the one she tried to keep safe, joyfully running towards her through the rubble. So not only is Vi furious and heartbroken that so many lives have just been lost, but she failed in her responsibility. She failed to keep Powder out of this.
I told you to stay away.
And her emotions take shape, and she hits her sister. Her reaction to this is completely realistic, but it's no less horrible to watch. None of this should even be happening. This is an insane amount of overwhelming fear, despair, anger for anyone, let alone a teenager, to handle. But she still hurt Powder. She has to step away. In the script, we get even more insight into Vi's feelings. She stares at her bloodied hand like a traitor. This moment connects her to Vander, father and daughter, with the same reminder. Cycles can be one choice away. Violence never leaves you. So she'll cool down, come back, and they'll figure out where to go from here. But enter Marcus. And now Powder, she doesn't have time to process with Vi what just happened, explain to Vi what she saw. Instead, what's the last thing Powder hears from her sister?
Because you're a Jinx! Do you hear me? Milo was right!
But without Vi able to return, all Powder sees, all she can understand, is the debilitating fear of being left. This human moment to be able to talk through a loss is taken from them. From this point on, she's forever trapped in that last conversation, lacking any comfort or closure. And in that critical moment, Silco shows up, and he gives her the thing she, as a little kid, needed most in that moment. Safety, or to be chosen. And his behavior here is calculated. He looks around for a moment, taking in what's happened. He wanted Vander and the kids gone, and in a fucked up way, she's done his work for him. And from his first line, we see that Silco projects his own feelings of betrayal onto this child.
I'll show them. We will show them all.
We see here how much Vi and Powder's circumstances have them trapped from all sides. Say Marcus hadn't taken her. Vi had run back out. Then what? 2 kids, one nearly exhausted from fighting, versus Silco and all his cronies? Without Powder reaching for comfort, Silco would have really had no reason not to finish the job. Of all the acts, Act 1's tragedy has the deepest sense of fate, of predestination. A key element in Greek tragedy, that you can't escape what's going to happen to you. No matter how we slice the last scenes, circumstances have sort of boxed them in such a way that there are no good choices. Had Powder stayed behind, she wouldn't have caused the explosion, and Deckard might have caught up to them anyway. In the alley, if Vi had run back, Silco would have killed them both. Unsurprisingly, the crushing end of Act 1 employs 3 out of 3 of the tragic conventions. The fatal flaw. Powder's relentless desire to help and refusal to listen causes the explosion. Vi's desire to protect her sister and fist-first reaction contribute to them being separated. The realization that changes everything.
You did this?
And finally, peripeteia, a sudden reversal of circumstances. They were almost out. The consequences of this night will ripple out throughout the entirety of the show. Vi's last interaction with her sister motivates her to find her again, and wraps her up in the rest of the ensuing plot. Powder/Jinx's resulting trauma from this night will have powerful effects on her, and eventually the future of the city. As I rewatched episode 3, I was struck by a simple question. Powder's just lost her adoptive father and brothers. Why isn't she grieving? Well, she can't. First of all, this is way too much for a child her age to deal with all at once. From that moment on, Powder insulates herself from the full impact of that moment. She goes from shock, to despair at Vi walking away, to anger. But at no point does she actually process what's happened. She doesn't even look at Vander's body, at part of the damage that she helped cause. In fact, she turns away towards Silco. At that moment, it's not safe to grieve. She doesn't have the space nor the external support to do so. And once she's taken in by Silco, she has even less. She certainly wouldn't be able to open up to the man that she'd have to admit to herself was the reason that this happened in the first place. We don't see what happens during the time skip, but whatever upbringing Jinx had with Silco radically transforms her. The contrast within Jinx is the most blatant and intense, to the point that her two selves have different names. But from Jinx's inaugural scene in episode 4, we see she's a person very much at war with herself. When we last saw her, Powder ran from a fight and was unable to hurt others even when trying to, and now Jinx is reintroduced as a terrifying force. Still, she very much carries around that child within her that never got to move on from that night, because while Jinx can be scary, at the same time, she's extremely childlike in her mannerisms and speech, her hair long as though she hasn't cut it since that day. When people are unable to integrate their traumatic memories, they seem to lose their capacity to assimilate new experiences as well. It is as if their personality stops at certain points and cannot enlarge anymore by the addition or assimilation of new elements. Unless they become aware of the split-off elements and integrate them into a story that had happened in the past but was now over, they would experience a slow decline in their personal and professional functioning. So while being taken in by Silco keeps her safe, it also keeps her stuck. Silco may have treated her immediate abandonment wound, but leaving the rest unaddressed and untreated sends her into psychological decay. Knowing Powder, we see that Jinx's extreme aggression is a trauma-induced adaptation, and one completely counter to her nature. And Silco rewards this behavior, of course, because not only is it useful, but it keeps her close. So for Jinx, this is a complete mental scramble. She at once associates violence with loss, fear, and the worst night of her life, and with praise, affection, and safety with Silco. But listen to how Silco speaks of violence.
It's a little crude, I'll admit. The base violence necessary for change.
This perspective is unsurprising when we look at how Silco fights. He uses Deckard, Savika, and other lackeys to do his dirty work. And more broadly, he uses Shimmer as a means to subdue large swaths of his own population. For how much he cares for her, he still sees the role he delegates to Jinx as base, one too low for him to stoop to.
But we both know Topside won't listen to anything else.
There is a truth to Silco's words, especially in how they apply to greater conflict. Inaction or peaceful resistance won't change the reality for Zaun, and it would be naive to pretend otherwise. However, it's not Vander, or even the kids, that are his enemy, the same way that Vi isn't Jinx's. Silco's perception of and love for Jinx is complicated by just how hard he projects onto her. In the spooky dark baptism scene, he neatly splits himself and the world into two, weak and strong, us and them. And from the way he talks, it's clear he projects onto Powder his self-hate, and on Jinx his ambition. In Jinx, he sees the new man he forged out of betrayal, and in Powder, something weak he left behind.
Betrayal. That pain that feels like it'll eat you from the inside out can either break you or forge you into something greater.
Since he believes his drowning was a rebirth, he urges Jinx to purge the discord within her by doing the same thing.
You need to let Powder die.
But that's the thing. Powder was never weak.
You know, Powder, what makes you different makes you strong.
Silco sees Jinx only partially, but how could he not? A fight over an ideology has left him with a permanent injury to his eye. While it doesn't seem like Silco has problems with his sight, it's hard to believe damage of that level hasn't had any impact. So if there is damage, which symbolically there is, Silco keeps it hidden, or outright denies that it's there. The same thing he asks Jinx to do with her own psychological injuries. Therefore, things he says like,
So the fear of pain will no longer control you.
aren't truths more than just Silco revealing his own perspective. Complete avoidance of painful memories doesn't bring you peace, quite the opposite. And we see this. Jinx's inconsistent relationship with her past is beautifully communicated by the show's visual language. Repeatedly, she's depicted back to back with family members, reminders of something too painful to look at head on. Because Jinx is at once so ferociously defined by and weighed down by her past, and at the same time is so unable to assimilate it. So that pain and guilt in the shape of her family remains at her back, out of sight but ever present. For the record, I love the fact that we first saw these glitchy visions on the bridge in episode 1, as the way a child might see violence, as something too monstrous to be real. So Jinx's mental projections aren't new, but a magnified perspective of a child who never got to grow up. Through Silco's point of view, Powder is a source of pain, so she must be destroyed. But that's not really in her best interest, it's in his. Because pain is scary, yes, but that alone isn't a reason to avoid it. Pain is a message, and it's part of living. There's a concept in dialectical behavioral therapy called radical acceptance. The entire premise of dialectical behavioral therapy is to acknowledge multiple contrasting truths. I have experienced this great loss, and I could experience safety and trust again. This person hurt me, and I still care about them. Radical acceptance is the notion that in order to progress through a difficult situation, you have to first acknowledge the unpleasantness of what is, rather than prolong your suffering wishing it were some other way. The reasons Powder is in pain won't go away just by wishing them. It's only through addressing what happened to her, what does she feel guilty for, what happened between her and Vi, that Jinx and Powder have any chance of integrating, and even starting to heal. But that would run counter to Silco's strategic and personal needs. A balanced, healthy Jinx doesn't make a very good weapon. And if their situations are the same, he can feel less alone. Silco internalized his betrayal from Vander and believes it made him a better and stronger version of himself. This version that's shrewd and ruthless. And so he tries to draw a comparison between himself and Vander, and Powder and Vi. The only problem is, aside from feelings of betrayal, the simple similarities end there. Vander and Silco were adults physically fighting over an ideological dispute. Powder and Vi were two children forcibly separated after being unable to process the death of their family. These are not remotely the same, but Silco simplifies them so they might appear to be. The problem is removing the context and distorting the details of their very different situations only exacerbates what we see as Jinx's fragmented perception of reality. Jinx is bombarded with conflicting messages, and they're pulling her apart. Vi went from her greatest source of comfort to her greatest source of fear. Seconds later, she's apparently chosen by someone who rewards her for destruction, for the very reason she was left. So, here's the paradox. In order to feel safe, she needs to feel chosen. And every time she completes a mission for Silco, she's praised. And every time she does so, she becomes the source of her own trauma. And the world, her own mind, and her own body are unsafe again. And so the cycle continues. Jinx is tormented by this past she can't integrate and a sister she still lets herself miss, a clue that she doesn't believe the everyone betrays us narrative, not fully. Because despite all of this, Jinx keeps remnants of her sister with her, and that makes it all the more heartbreaking. After all this hurt and all this time, she hasn't severed herself from Vi completely. Just like her brothers, Vi haunts her, but she haunts her in her pink and blue nails and the splashes of pink all around her. Even her name, a reference to the last thing Vi called her, is at once something negative, something bitter, but it's still a name that links her to Vi and the events of that day. With Silco, there might be safety, but with Vi, there could be hope. And that hope hasn't been completely lost, because Jinx lights the flare. Jinx finds out Vi has been looking for her and arrives with fresh wounds courtesy of Sevika.
Vi?
She sinks into Vi's arms, and we see that Powder hasn't been completely extinguished.
I never thought I'd see you again. Are you real?
And then, of course, immediate fear.
Things changed when you left. I changed.
This is such a small moment, but such an important clue of how aware Jinx is of the discord inside her. Just like before, Vi offers her only understanding.
I know. Pow, I know. You did what you had to do to survive. Me too. It's okay.
In an extremely delicate moment, Kate shows up, and it all spirals out of control.
Who's she?
Sevika wasn't lying? Well, about Vi being with an enforcer, technically sure, but even then, Kate was an enforcer for maybe a day, which is kicked off by sneaking Vi out of jail and then proceeds to spend the rest continuing to break the law. And Sevika was lying about Vi's intentions. But it doesn't matter. A little doubt is already too much for Jinx. And now they're at an impasse. Jinx is fully in hypervigilant fear mode. She can't be abandoned again. Nothing Vi says at this moment will convince her otherwise.
It's Jinx now. Powder fell down a well.
The wording here is curious. It evokes drowning. Who pushed her down the well? Either way, seems she took Silco's words to heart. Here, Jinx creates distance between herself and her actions. When she says this, she doesn't even look at Vi, but to the side, as though she's negotiating with herself. But when she can't hide beneath the surface, when people who remind her of Powder come back, we see a sliver of vulnerability. And when she pushes back, she does so with very specific dialogue.
You're not a Jinx. God, I never should have.
Stop talking to me like I'm a child!
Compare this to an earlier moment.
I'm a helpless little girl, and I set the building on fire. By accident. Totally by accident.
So Jinx is aware, at least sometimes, of her split nature. She's conscious of how people perceive her enough to weaponize it. In her choice of language, she prods at two things: her defensive rage around her own vulnerability, and Vi's protective instincts. Two things connecting her to Powder, and two big parts of that night. In this highly charged scene, the contrast and the dissonance is on clear display between what Jinx wants to feel, vulnerability, trust in Vi's best intentions, and fear that she's wrong.
Are you real?
That dissonance would be especially high now, given how she spent her adolescence with a man who rewards her aggression. If Silco wants me to fight rather than shield me from it, how could that have been a reason for Vi to leave? So she obviously misses and wants to find comfort in Vi. But when she gets close enough to try, her mind is overridden. She just can't. Being wrong is too high a cost. Traumatized people chronically feel unsafe in their bodies. The past is alive in the form of a gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs, and in an attempt to control these processes, they often become experts at ignoring their gut feelings, and in numbing awareness of what is played out inside, they learn to hide from themselves.
This is a trick. You're playing me. Shut up! I'm in no mood.
Jinx's demeanor can shift on a dime, from vulnerable to vengeful in a split second. In particular, it's the sincerity of Vi's touch that sends her spiraling. It's no surprise if we remember how physical their affection used to be. If Vi can care for her, what does it mean to be who she is now? And what does she make of Silco? But before the conversation can make any progress, they're again interrupted. Jinx reacts, and in a reflection of Act 1, Vi is taken away by forces outside her control, leaving their conversation still unfinished. But something is different. Vi isn't angry, she's heartbroken, incredulous at Jinx laughing, shooting haphazardly around her. Now the girl who cried after hurting others by accident is almost giddy doing it on purpose. Jinx has now become the thing her sister wanted most to protect her from. Jinx has become a tool of war.
Whatever happens, it's on you.
Tragedy in this scene is built from a basic fact. They both want the same thing. They both love each other, and both miss each other. Jinx wants safety with Vi, and Vi wants to give it to her. And it's not enough. The end of Act 2 also repeats Ananorisis, the revelation. Vi discovers just how much her sister has changed. It's one thing to hear it, it's a completely different thing to experience it firsthand. Is the continuation of,
You did this?
and finally, there's another reversal of fate. Here, we get another almost. Vi and Jinx almost get to talk. Had they not been interrupted, this is no guarantee things would have gone well, but any potential progress is completely thrown out the window. It seems as though Vi and Powder are going to reunite. Then they get a brief moment of affection, only to be torn apart again. Vi is captured and taken away from her sister for a second time, but this time it's not by an enemy.
I missed you, little man.
Echo clocks Vi right away.
I should have been there. For you. For everyone.
That's a good way to drive yourself crazy.
Now, I talk a lot about agency and choice, but I think it's important to make an addendum when talking about systems of power. Yes, in the philosophical abstract, we each have a choice of what to do with the situations we're given, and acknowledging our ability to choose allows us to live a meaningful life. So it can be tempting, when discussing individual agency, to underplay the role of systems and institutions. We always have a choice. Sure. But in the same way that we don't choose to be anchored to the ground by gravity or choose not to grow wings and fly, there are forces that limit choices to a degree that they almost become negligible. Poverty, war, political oppression can exert a force as inevitable as gravity. For Vi, her responsibility feels like truth, but the forces that threw her in jail and kept her there were far out of her control. And then, Echo discusses Jinx and Powder. But we'll come back to that.
I didn't lose her. They took her. She was there for me, not the Enforcer.
Despite her years spent with Silco, we see how much her belief in Vi has endured, because Jinx confronts him, and she's angry. Like Savika, Silco stokes her insecurities, further muddling her perception of reality. Because Vi can reach Powder, she's a threat. Vi could share her half of that night, the things she didn't get to say, and most dangerously, if Jinx were to discuss her past, she'd have to confront anger at Silco for being the reason it all happened, the reason Vi had to fight off adults twice her size, the reason Vander was captured, the reason Deckard was ordered to kill them all, the reason she sent her monkey bomb.
Who found you? Who cared for you? Gave you a home? I am your family. Everyone else betrays us.
This line is so out of pocket. The only reason she needed a new home is because she killed her family by accident to protect them from being killed on purpose by Silco. Not to mention that he was seconds away from doing the same thing to her. Appealing to her desire to be needed, Silco reminds her of her job.
You have to complete the weapon.
Silco very awarely recognizes the source of Jinx's pain as feelings of abandonment, so he encourages those feelings in a way that supports his own absolutist, black and white views. So Jinx is more than a deadly weapon, she's also an emotional crutch, someone to share his deep dark feelings of betrayal.
Everyone else betrays us.
This doesn't mean that Silco doesn't feel real care, but he doesn't care for all parts of her equally. He incisively encourages and discourages parts of her based on their use to his cause and his personal needs. When I watched this, their relationship immediately reminded me of another very similar dynamic. Spoilers, I guess, for Buffy Season 3. If you want to watch that and you haven't, okay. 3, 2... The relationship it reminded me of is between former ally turned antagonist Faith and the big bad the Mayor in Buffy Season 3. Faith spends time with the team until she kills someone by accident, and then she's taken in by the Mayor before compounding violence sends her into a complete spiral where she thinks she can only ever be a terrible person because of what she's done. There are several significant differences, of course, but the point is, over the course of the season, Faith and the Mayor develop a legitimately sweet and weirdly endearing relationship. He treats her like a daughter, takes risks to protect her, and even places her safety above his own plans. But just like with Silco and Jinx, or Thanos and Gamora, the question doesn't start and end with how much care did they feel, It can't be as simple as that. It's also, what did they ask of and expect of them, and where did those expectations lead? Vi and Jinx's second reunion isn't much better. It's actually much worse. With a subtle twist of language, Silco sharpens Jinx's doubt into paranoia. She sees Vi hug Caitlyn and her shaky sense of trust collapses. With the amount of times she's had her reality called into question, how can she make out what people really mean? Vi loved me, but she left, but then she came back? Silco protected me, but he lied to protect me? Jinx's conundrum isn't just about figuring out what's real, but what do I risk if I'm wrong? And now Vi has the gall not only to accompany an enforcer, one of those who caused them so much grief, but she's hugging her. Of course, in her current state, Jinx wouldn't see the irony of the fact that, yes, Vi's with an enforcer, Kate's basically a defector by this point, but she's been working for Silco, who harmed them in the lanes just as much if not more, and Silco's been working with Marcus. But logic doesn't matter here. This is the realm of feelings and survival instincts. For Jinx, it's a simple equation. If Vi has any reason to leave, any other priority, Jinx can't feel safe. So when Vi comes back for Kate in danger, the thing she apparently couldn't do for Powder, it's too much. Without exchanging any words, Jinx shoots. At Kate and at her sister. And now, for a third time, after an episode of violence, Powder disappears under the surface of Jinx, and then Vi is gone. Let's talk about Echo and Jinx. Echo is the first to assert that
Powder's gone, Vi. All that's left is Jinx.
Agreeing with Jinx herself.
It's Jinx now. Powder fell down a well.
Echo's words have a couple of meanings behind them. Firstly, he wasn't privy to the ugly details of that night, including Vi's own behavior, and so he has less clarity on what factors exactly brought Jinx into existence. Lacking that understanding, Jinx working for Silco because she wants to seems like a much simpler answer. But Jinx's motivations are, like everything, a bit more jumbled than that. Second, and maybe more relevant, Echo still doesn't totally believe that. Because despite
Powder's gone, Vi.
An episode ago, once on the bridge, his first tactic is to appeal to their past, to a game they played. And when he looks at her up close, he sees someone he can't bring himself to hurt. Unable to reach her sister, Vi at least tries for an audience with the council to help the Undercity, but she's met with bureaucratic inaction. Defeated in this moment, Vi shifts to a very particular mode of black and white thinking. She describes the world around her as something firmly divided and irreconcilable, even her and Kate. Deteriorating under the influence of Shimmer, Jinx's paranoias blur with reality. She sees Kate and Vi both taunt her with the thing she fears most, that she's unlovable. Finally, during the grotesque dinner scene, Jinx brings all the pieces together to make sense of them once and for all. Jinx is at a breaking point, and she needs answers.
Are we still sisters?
Vi is real. She knows this now. The new question is, what are they to each other?
Send her on her way in. And you can have Powder back.
Jinx starts to negotiate. She wants to be able to be Powder, whatever that means, as if she could turn it on and off. No, Vi shooting Kate wouldn't accomplish anything other than make Vi more like Jinx, and some crude attempt to cure her loneliness. Maybe she feels Vi could only understand her if she becomes her. But so much has changed, which leaves Jinx with two avenues. Trust Vi and trust herself. Accept that things have changed and start working with her sister to understand each other again. But that's hard, and there's risk in that. Risk in not being chosen. Risk in ending up alone again. What if I've done too much? What if Vi's scared of me? If I leave Silco and then Vi rejects me too, what then? So do I just stay with Silco, where I know I'll be wanted? But then Silco shoots Vi, and on instinct, she acts. And just before she kills her father, again, Silco tells her she's perfect. This is such a twisted goodbye. Let's look at what's happening here. Jinx is on the verge of losing another caretaker, and Vi, her last surviving family, is right there. Vi, who he knows loves Jinx enough to be a threat, Vi, who he knows Jinx has torn herself apart, missing. And instead of giving one last, begrudging blessing, a bitter, "You're all she has, take care of her," he twists the knife one last time. He leaves her with one final, confusing message to undermine her sense of trust. So many conflicting things intersect. The horror at herself for what she's done, Silco's encouragement, the way this is all a terrible mirror to the night that changed her forever, all while Shimmer infects her mind. She has no idea what she wants or what she needs at this point. Silco chose her, but now he's gone. And 3 times now, when she's been violent, Vi has disappeared. How could she accept her after all of this? Easier, then.
But he didn't make Jinx. You did.
Wouldn't that be simple? If just one person made Jinx. But the far more tangled truth is that Jinx is a product of experiences, circumstances, and choices, cauterized with each act of violence. If Vi really abandoned her, then easy. She's Jinx. But if any part of Vi is sincere, if under any circumstance Vi could love her again, what now? All that violence at Silco's right hand, and for what? There are no more routes open to her, she believes. Just one. So she chooses. Vi can't love her, Silco is gone, Powder is dead. All that's left is the violence. All that's left is Jinx. And Jinx would fire. The tragedy here is twofold. Instead of being separated by circumstance, the sisters are now separated by choice. Jinx's fear wins, and she chooses. And secondly, Jinx and Vi's inability to reconcile directly results in the greater conflict continuing. And finally, we get our last almost, our last most devastating peripeteia. Zaun was almost free. In the final minutes of episode 9, the final confrontation between Vi and Jinx ties the consequences of their relationship directly to the world around them. Arcane is full of tension between dualities. Topside and bottom, mind and body, magic and tech, oil and water, Powder and Jinx. Jinx and the world around her are both trying to make sense of their halves. So, if it turns out Jinx can find balance between her two sides, maybe it follows that the world around her can. Vi and Jinx's story asks the big question at a personal level. Can there be balance between contrasting forces, and if so, how? The future of Zaun and the sisters' relationship requires an answer to this. At this point, we're in no place to get one. While Jinx teeters between her two halves, Vi doesn't fully comprehend the Jinx side until it's too late. We get a pretty big hint that things with Jinx won't go well when, an episode before their final meeting, Vi reveals a new mindset.
It wasn't enough. Top side and bottom, oil and water, that's all there is.
By the same metric, two other opposites, Jinx and Powder, must be two irreconcilable things. And if we look closely, the pain causing Jinx's internal fracture has two potential outlets, reflected in two philosophies around her, Silco's and Echo's. These philosophies give us two models for dealing with loss. Silco's model insulates. His suffering marks him as unique, strips him of empathy, and posits a worldview of absolutes. Beyond his circle of two, there's hardly curiosity towards or solidarity with others. By contrast, Echo in the Firelight's model acknowledges that suffering is shared, especially that which is cyclical and systemic. Silco even recognizes Echo in the Firelights as his ideological enemy when he tries to bribe Marcus into framing them for his and Jinx's actions.
You built all this?
Not alone.
Echo's model is such a direct counter to Silco's, in the way it's based on caring as much for the Undercity as they hate Piltover. And comparing them, there's no contest. Especially in Arcane, built on these very realistic, large-scale conflicts of war, poverty, and addiction, everyone has lost. Silco's hardly special. What Vander figured out and tried to pass on all that time ago.
Nobody wins in war, Vi.
This is true from the very start until the end. Vi and Jinx's sheer determination to protect each other actually caused them to be separated for years. They're then robbed of the ability to have a young and human reaction to violence and loss. Not only that, but they're now forced to continue growing up and deal with their pain and trauma, completely alienated from community. As a teenager, Vi is thrown in jail, separated from others, and repeatedly brutalized by guards. While Jinx may have gained an empathetic figure, even a father, in Silco, she loses her family, and is then cut off from any other meaningful relationships in the process.
It's not enough to give people what they need to survive. You have to give them what they need to live.
We get an even more explicit comparison of these two ideologies in the back-to-back scenes of Echo showing the refuge and Silco's meeting with his Chembarons. The Firelight Refuge is built around this massive tree. This is clearly a place of rehabilitation where people can have fresh starts. They don't turn away from pain. The mural honors loss, but is really a work of love. In Silco's scene, they're surrounded by plants in a greenhouse of some kind. He needs to make a show of power to his subordinates who he believes have grown too entitled. To do so, he fills the air with the noxious gas of the mines they were once forced to work in. When he poisons the air, withholding the cure of the masks, it kills the plants in the room in the process. This is all a nice little microcosm of his use of shimmer, making a whole environment uninhabitable to maintain control. So we see here that Silco's is a vicious cycle. He creates suffering and then keeps the remedy to himself as leverage. Echo and the Firelights represent positive cycles, centered around a tree that in return provides them shelter and clean air. So Silco acts as though his crusade is revenge in the name of the Lanes, even though he seems to have a very narrow scope of who that actually encompasses. So what differentiates Silco's and Echo's models is the path forward. For Silco, loss is self-indulgent and vengeful. It makes you broody, bitter, and unlike other people. He resists healing for himself and for those around him. A broken Jinx lets him feel less alone. In contrast, for the Firelights, loss is what connects you to everyone else. And so healing is not only possible, it's based in compassion. As a concept, duality just tells us things have multiple qualities. It doesn't tell us what we make of that. Are these opposites irreconcilable, or can they be synthesized somehow? Silco embodies absolutist duality. Everyone betrays us and them. Kill Powder, be Jinx. And that's realistic sometimes. Oil and water truly will not mix. But especially in human matters, things aren't always that clear-cut. Vi and Jinx's entire emotional arc is a, so far unsuccessful, attempt to make sense of these contrasts. They each propose their own way to deal with the torment within Jinx. It's the impediment to what they both want. So how do they bridge it? Vi doesn't understand the intensity of it and is taken aback. But Jinx is in denial as well, proposing an ultimatum that she'll just be Powder again, if Vi joins her. By this point, Vi's had some of her black and white perspective challenged by her partnership with Caitlyn. But because Jinx hasn't been allowed to have meaningful contact with others, she hasn't had the same opportunity to broaden her worldview. Hence why it's so significant that Jinx asks Vi to kill Kate. Silco sees with half his sight, and by the end, Jinx is affected in the same way. Her own shattered mirror shows her with an injury just like Silco, and in episode 9, her eyes have fully changed color with shimmer. And just like Silco, Jinx becomes unable to see things as they are, but instead sees them how they feel. She follows her most recent father's pattern. He wants Jinx to be more like him, so he can feel less lonely, asking her to drown herself in order to mimic his own metaphor. And Jinx hastily tries the same tactic on Vi. Her demands of Vi are very particular. Vi has to bridge the gap by becoming more like her, commit to Jinx's absolutist loyalty, and, like she did, bear the guilt of killing someone she cares about. But that's the whole thing this disjointed negotiation misses. Vi already has lost. She's lost many of the same people Jinx has, the same two families, and on top of it, Powder. Vi has her own burdens and complexes and ghosts, as unique as her sisters. Of course, neither of these routes, denial or ridiculous ultimatum, are viable, and so we leave this season without a resolution. At risk of quoting Into the Woods, things aren't always or, they can also be and. In Avatar, there's this great line,
"The greatest illusion of this world is the illusion of separation. Things you think are separate and different are actually one and the same."
Topside and bottom aren't opposites, but part of an interconnected system made of contributions from both. Victor is from Zon, but studies Hextech for Piltover. Kate was an enforcer and ends up protecting Vi. Magic and tech confuse, and so on. The messy thing is, Powder and Jinx coexist as lived experiences, and denying either won't solve anything. Vi can't pretend her sister hasn't changed, and Jinx doesn't have to crush her own vulnerability to survive. Already, there are hints on Vi's side that she might be able to meet her sister somewhere in the middle, eventually. In the prologue, when Powder beats up on herself, Vi reassures her with enormous empathy, literally pointing out to her the evidence that
We've all had bad days. But we learn. And we stick together.
making the case that everyone's made mistakes, everyone's failed. When they meet again years later and Jinx reveals to her that she's changed, tears in her eyes, Vi's immediate response is equally empathetic.
No, Pow, I know. You did what you had to do to survive. Me too. It's okay.
Of course, there are things left unresolved. In particular, the events of episode 9 push everyone past a line that's going to be very hard to come back from. There is a path forward, but it's not an easy one by any stretch. This story isn't finished, so my analysis isn't either. As I write this, Season 2 is but a glimmer in the Arcane writer's eye. I don't know where the story is going to go, and I'm not going to speculate. The story and characters may well be tethered to the lore and a predetermined end, but I can only hope not in a way that shortcuts interesting storytelling. I've heard from sources more ingrained in League of Legends than myself that the lore has changed significantly before and may well continue to be updated with the show. Whatever happens, we'll just see. Wherever the story goes, this relationship is the emotional and philosophical linchpin of what comes next. The big juicy questions of what kind of peace can be reached by opposing forces, within and between, and if so, what would that even look like? In their perfect way, Jinx and Vi have now tied the intimate to the grandiose, to eventually either provide relief or more heartbreak. Whatever that ends up being, I'm really excited to see it.